Bransen from GMAT Ninja here, and welcome to the 11th episode of our sentence correction series, in which we will cover part 2 of comparisons. We covered part 1 of comparisons in our previous episode, and in this episode we're going to cover comparisons that are those without a clear marker, those that are a little bit less mechanical, you could say. We're also going to cover comparisons that include the words more than, although, whereas, and we'll go through some comparisons with ellipses, what's commonly referred to as ellipses, ellipsis, and we'll share a little bit of our take on that. Before we dive into some official questions, I actually wanted to go through a couple basic examples here before we got started. You'll see on the screen I have 2 examples written here. The first one is that Abe liked hummus more than Ike, and the second is Abe liked hummus more than falafel. Now, both of these are comparisons, and you'll notice that the comparison in both of these is more than. Don't get confused by the word like used as a verb here. But both of these have a comparison with the word more than, and both of them have essentially the same structure. You have Abe, he liked hummus in both instances more than something else. But what you'll see here is this, and part of the reason that we bring this up is that the whole idea of ellipses can be a little bit shaky, and it really depends. A lot of this really depends on context, which is why we encourage being much more logical in your thinking in the way that you think through an example like this. So, for example, with this first one, Abe liked hummus more than Ike. Well, I could say Abe liked hummus more than Ike liked hummus, or am I saying that Abe liked hummus more than he liked Ike? It's really not clear from this first version of the sentence whether Abe likes hummus more than he likes Ike, or whether Abe likes hummus more than Ike likes hummus. Now, so with this sentence, you would have to say that, okay, if I was trying to say that Abe likes hummus more than Ike likes hummus, I would have to say probably that Abe liked hummus more than Ike did. However, here, in the second version of the sentence, it says Abe liked hummus more than falafel. Well, that version of the sentence, actually, I don't have a problem with. And the reason for that is this, is because it's clear to me, logically speaking, that Abe likes hummus more than he likes falafel as a food. Not that Abe likes hummus more than falafel likes hummus. Obviously, falafel can't like hummus. And so the reason I bring up these two examples at the beginning is that I want you to see that in each instance here, I have what would be commonly called an ellipsis in each of these 2 examples. But I can't really create a rule because it's kind of context dependent. My first example, well, I don't really love it because it's not clear, does Abe like hummus more than Ike likes hummus, or does Abe like hummus more than he likes Ike? Versus my second sentence, the exact same structure, more than followed by noun, exact same structure, but the meaning is clear. And so this is why we want to be really careful when it comes to comparisons about just creating some rule. It's really, as with much of GMAT sentence correction, it always comes back to meaning. And so I'm always going to want to think about meaning and whether the meaning or the logic of the sentence is clear. And especially when we get into some of these more challenging comparisons, focusing on meaning is going to be all the more important. So I want to go ahead and dive into we're going to go straight into some official examples here. I'm going to pop it up on the screen, and remember to be very literal as you can about comparisons. Take a second, work through it, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it together. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a second to work through this one. It says, according to a study by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, companies in the United States are providing job training and general education for nearly 8 million people, about equivalent to the enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities. I want to go ahead and take a look at this one together on the board. And this is one where, again, we're going to need to be very literal about the comparison that's being made. First, I would note is that this is one of those comparisons that doesn't have the typical clear marker word like or as or as many as or something like that. But I do have a comparison still here, and the comparison is set off by the word equivalent, about equivalent to. And so as I look at A, my question becomes, what is about equivalent to the enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities? Well, according to the version of sentence in A, companies in the United States are providing job training and general education for nearly 8 million people. So nearly 8 million people are what is about equivalent to the enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities. Now, this can get a little bit tricky, but the word equivalent typically will imply the same or similar in quality or in function. The problem here is this, is that are nearly 8 million people similar in quality or in function to the collective enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities? Well, not really. What I'm trying to say is that the nearly 8 million people is the same in number, but not really that they're the same in quality or that they're the same in function as those as the enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities. So I can eliminate A because I don't love the fact that I'm trying to say that nearly 8 million people are somehow, and again, the word equivalent really throws me off here, similar in what quality or function to the enrollment. No, I don't love that comparison, so I'm going to eliminate A. With B, I have that the nearly 8 million people are about the equivalent of those enrolled in. Well, the word those sticks out to me here, and those presumably refers to people, so are about the equivalent of the people enrolled in the nation's four-year colleges and universities. And for what it's worth, I actually like this comparison a little bit better because I'm comparing nearly 8 million people to people rather than comparing nearly 8 million people to the collective enrollment. In A, I was comparing 8 million people to a collective enrollment versus in B, I'm comparing people to people. So I like that aspect better. I do like those that I have here in B. The problem is still this, is the word equivalent to implying that they're somehow, the 8 million people are somehow the same as those who are enrolled in the nation's four-year colleges. And really, that's not what the sentence is trying to say. I'm not saying that those 8 million people are the same as maybe they all have brown hair. They're about equivalent to. But that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that they're the same in number, and equivalent to doesn't really convey that in this instance, and so I can eliminate B. Again, I can understand how this would be not a super satisfying reason to eliminate A and B, but in this video, we're getting into those more challenging comparisons where I have to be very, very literal when thinking about the comparison that's being made here. Are the people equivalent to each other? No, that's not really what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that the number of the people is the same in each instance. Here with C, I have about equal to those who are enrolled. in the nation's four-year colleges and universities. Now, again, I like those who are enrolled because I'm comparing people to people here. That feels good to me, but now I have the word equal. Well, it's a great thought and it's a great sentiment about equality that people, these 8 million people, are equal to the people who are enrolled in the nation's four-year colleges and universities. But again, simply saying that those 8 million people are equal does not actually tell me that the number of people is equal to the number of people. So again, the comparison's not clear. Equal in what way? If it said equal in number, okay, I'd feel a lot better about that. But equal in what way? And right now it just seems to generally speak about equality. And while that's a great sentiment, that doesn't work here on the GMAT for a literal comparison. And so I can eliminate C for that reason. Now, with D here, about as many as. So these 8 million people are about as many as the enrollment of. So I really like as many as here. As many as feels good to me because I know I'm comparing number to number. But here I have as these 8 million people are about as many as the enrollment. And the problem is that the enrollment speaks collectively. And so I'm comparing 8 million people to the collective enrollment of the nation's four-year colleges and universities. So I don't love that. And for that reason, I'm going to eliminate it. You'll notice here with E, I have about as many as are enrolled in. So as many as presumably those who are enrolled in, right? So 8 million people are about as many as are the number of people that are enrolled in the nation's four-year colleges and universities. Here, I like my comparison. I have 8 million people compared with those who are enrolled in. So comparing people to people, I really like that. The comparison looks good. I know what I'm comparing because I have as many as, which tells me I'm comparing number. And so I feel good and I can choose E, and E is the best answer choice in this instance. Now, I totally get it that this is not as satisfying as the first video on comparisons where I stood up here and I said, like Bo is like Ruth, Bo is not like hummus, or whatever may be the case. This is much less satisfying, but often on the GMAT, these comparisons will become a little bit more challenging. And as these comparisons become more challenging, you have to get more and more literal. Here, even with D, I don't want to compare the enrollment to 8 million people. I want to compare 8 million people to people who are enrolled in the nation's four-year colleges and universities. With that in mind, you get a taste of how literal we want you to be. We're going to go ahead and take a look at another one in another official example. I'll go ahead and pop it up on the screen, take a second to work through it, and then once you're done working through it, we'll come back and we'll take a look at it together. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a moment to work through this one. The question says, whereas a ramjet generally cannot achieve high speeds without the initial assistance of a rocket, high speeds can be attained by scramjets or supersonic combustion ramjets in that they reduce airflow compression at the entrance of the engine and letting air pass through at supersonic speeds. So I want to take a look at this one together on the board. And the word whereas is similar to the word although in that it introduces a comparison between clauses. So what I've got here is this, is a ramjet generally cannot. So what I want to do is I want to compare what a ramjet cannot do to something else. Now, logically speaking, it would make sense to compare what a ramjet cannot do to what a scramjet can do. And so if any of my options or any of my choices are going to give me that option, then I will have, I'll like that a lot better than what I have here. The problem with what I have here is this, is I'm comparing a ramjet generally cannot to high speeds can be. And so I'm comparing what high speeds can do to what a ramjet cannot do, which is really not the comparison I want to make. I want to compare what a ramjet cannot do to what a scramjet can do. And so for that reason, I can eliminate A. Now, it's not the focus of this video, but you'll notice that A also has a parallelism issue here with the and letting at the end of the sentence. If I look at B, again, I want to compare what a ramjet cannot do to something. So in this instance with B, I'm comparing a ramjet cannot achieve high speeds to that high speeds can be attained by. Now, it would make sense for me to compare that high speeds cannot be attained by to that high speeds can be attained by, or how high speeds can be attained to how high speeds cannot be attained. But it doesn't make sense for me to compare what a ramjet cannot do to how high speeds can be attained, or that high speeds can be attained. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate B. With C, although you'll notice that B fixed my parallelism issue here as well, if you're tracking with that. Now, with C, I'm comparing here a ramjet generally cannot achieve high speeds. So what a ramjet cannot do to the ability of scramjets to achieve high speeds is because. In other words, I'm comparing what a ramjet cannot do to why scramjets can do something. But that's not really what I want to compare what one cannot do to what the other cannot do, or why one can't to why another one can't. And because the comparison here, even in D is illogical, I'm sorry, in C is illogical, I can eliminate C. With D, whereas a ramjet generally cannot achieve high speeds, to scramjets, supersonic combustion ramjets have the ability of attaining high speeds when reduced. I actually like this a little bit better. The problem here is this. It's not so much a comparison issue here as I have scramjets have the ability. Now, one of the nuances that you'll see often, or not often on the GMAT, one of the nuances that you'll see on the GMAT is the word ability is a bit unique. The word ability implies agency, and agency is not something that a scramjet would possess. You and I have agency, a monkey would have agency, a fish would have agency, the ability to make a choice. Scramjets don't really have agency, and so you wouldn't say that scramjets have the ability. You would say that scramjets can attain high speeds. The other problem is there's a little bit of ambiguity with D as it relates to where the parallelism starts. Does it start with attaining? Does it start with reducing? And I also don't love the word when here for at a certain time. So for all three of those reasons, and again, I'm going through this kind of quickly with D because I really want to focus on the comparison here, and D doesn't really get into the comparison issue so much. I'm going to eliminate D. With E, I have a ramjet generally cannot achieve high speeds compared to scramjets can attain high speeds. So what a ramjet cannot do compared to what a scramjet can do, and all of a sudden my comparison's good. You'll also notice by reducing and letting, my parallelism's good, and so E rectifies the issues that I had in all of my other answer choices. Now, let me just note this real quickly as well as it relates to this question. the tendency is going to be to want to make a super hard and fast rule of this is the way that it has to be, and the clause has to start like that. Be careful. I'm looking for a logical comparison. I'm looking to make the best possible logical comparison while being very literal. And that's what E allows me to do here. Make the best possible logical comparison as I can, comparing what a ramjet cannot do to what scramjets can. I want to go ahead and I want to take a look at another one with you. We'll go ahead and flash this one up on the screen, and we'll talk about it together. Awesome. Hopefully you've had a second to work through this one. It says, officials at the United States Mint believe that the Sacagawea dollar coin will be used more as a substitute for 4 quarters rather than for the dollar bill because its weight, only 8.1 grams, is far less than 4 quarters, which weigh 5.67 grams each. A couple different comparisons going on here as we look at this one on the board. One earlier in the sentence, more as a substitute for, and then one later in the sentence, far less than. Now, with the first version of this sentence in A, I actually don't love my comparison because its weight is far less than 4 quarters. The weight is less than 4 quarters. Maybe the weight is less than the weight of 4 quarters, but if I'm being very literal, and again, that's the theme here, is be very literal about your comparison. Its weight is not less than 4 quarters. Its weight is less than the weight of 4 quarters. And so for that reason, I can go ahead right off the bat and eliminate A. With B here, I have more as a substitute for 4 quarters than the dollar bill because it weighs only 8.1 grams, far lighter than. So 8.1 grams is far lighter than 4 quarters, which weigh only 5.67 grams each. Well, I've got a little bit of a problem with this one as well, because I think I really would like to say more as a substitute for 4 quarters than for the dollar bill. The way it's written is it seems like, is the Sacagawea coin being used as a substitute more than the dollar bill is being used as a substitute? Or am I saying that the Sacagawea coin is being used as a substitute for the 4 quarters more than it's being used for the dollar bill? In this instance, it seems like all I'm saying is the Sacagawea dollar coin is replacing 4 quarters more than the dollar bill is replacing 4 quarters. But really, I think what I want to say is that the Sacagawea dollar coin is replacing 4 quarters more often than it replaces the dollar bill. So I don't love that. And then I also don't love the at the end of the sentence, because it weighs far lighter than 4/4, I think I could say it is far lighter than 4/4, or I could say it weighs less than 4/4, but I don't love it weighs far lighter than, and so I'm going to go ahead and eliminate B. With C, as a substitute for 4/4 more than for the dollar bill, okay, there it's clear to me. More than for the dollar bill, for 4/4 more than for the dollar bill, so it substitutes for 4/4 more than it substitutes for the dollar bill. Because it weighs only 8.1 grams, far less than 4/4. So it weighs less than 4/4. I love the comparison there. It's solid, it's logical, even when I'm very literal about it. I'm going to keep C. With D, as a substitute, so as a substitute for 4/4, more than, and again, I like the more than here a little bit more than the rather than, but I don't want to focus on the idiom. As a substitute for 4/4, more than the dollar bill, I probably would prefer some sort of for here. I would probably prefer that, again, because of the comparison thing I highlighted just a moment ago. Also, because its weight of only 8.1 grams is far lighter than it. What does it refer to here? Got to be very literal when it comes to these comparisons. And presumably, it refers to weight. So its weight of only 8.1 grams is far lighter than its weight is for 4/4, but its weight for 4/4, its weight is for 4/4 doesn't make sense. So again, I don't love I have a little bit of a pronoun issue that turns into a comparison issue here with D, and so I'm going to eliminate D because of that. With E, as a substitute for more for 4/4 rather than for the dollar bill, again, I don't know if I love the rather than. I think idiomatically that's incorrect, but I don't want to focus on that. Let me focus on the comparison. Because its weight, only 8.1 grams, is far less than it is for 4/4. So its weight is far less than, again, I have this it here. And if I say, the only thing I can think of that it would refer to would be its weight. So its weight only 8.1 grams. Its weight is far less than its weight is for 4/4. But again, I don't want to compare its weight to its weight for 4/4. I want to compare its weight to the weight of 4/4, which is a different thing entirely. And so again, I have a comparison issue here in E. C is the most sound comparison logically, and it gives me the best version of the sentence. Again, this is another example of where being very, very literal as can be, about the comparison that's being made. You notice that we had some issues in the first comparison with the for, and we had some issues in the second comparison, what exactly was being compared. There, you also could get into countable, non-countable stuff with this one. Plenty of other issues, but wanted to highlight the comparison. So key is be very, very literal for these comparisons. Also noting that there is a comparison when it's not super explicitly marked by something like the word like or as. Let's go ahead and I want to take a look at one more. I'll pop it up on the screen and we'll take a look at it together. Wonderful. Hopefully you've had a second to work through this one. The question says, in no other historical sighting did Halley's Comet cause such a worldwide sensation as did its return in 1910 to 1911. So this one, as we look at it on the board, this is one of the hardest questions that's out there as it relates to comparisons on the GMAT. But if you're very literal, this question all of a sudden becomes way easier. So you'll notice that I have the word as here, but what am I comparing to the word as? What am I using the word as to compare? Well, I'm comparing in no other historical sighting. So essentially, I'm comparing other historical sightings to the 1910-1911 historical sighting. Now, that's going to help me. I want to compare in other historical sightings to in this historical sighting. What you'll notice here is that A doesn't really preserve that comparison. I have in no other historical sightings compared to its return in 1910 to 1911 did. Well, so that's not really a logical comparison, comparing in other historical sightings to its what return in 1910 to 1911 did. I really would rather in other historical sightings versus in this historical sighting. I guess I could say that did refers back to cause and then becomes caused, but in no other historical sighting did Halley's Comet cause such a worldwide sensation as caused its return. But again, the comparison just doesn't work because of the word in. I could, take out the word in and then mess around with the sentence, but the word in is part of the sentence, and so it just doesn't set up a logical comparison there and there. Same problem really here in B, except on top of all of that, I have this word had, and the word had presumably maybe turns this into the past perfect, except there's no real reason here to use the past perfect. It doesn't make sense to use the past perfect as had caused. It's 1910 to 1911 return had caused. But what other event taking place in the past has this before? And it really, obviously I still have the in issue in the historical sightings versus in the historical sighting. So I have that issue, but on top of that, the word had just doesn't work here. C, now this looks promising. In other historical sightings, as in its return of 1910 to 1911. Now, you'll notice here that that many students would love to see, after the word as, I have some sort of verb. But I don't necessarily need a verb here. It's kind of implied, and the meaning of the sentence is clear. In no other historical sighting did Halley's Comet cause such a worldwide sensation as the worldwide sensation that it caused in its return of 1910 to 1911. So I have in other historical sightings versus in its return. I like C. I'm going to keep C. With D, its return of 1910 to 1911 did, pretty similar to A. Again, presumably the word did refers back to cause, but I want to compare in other historical sightings to in this particular historical sighting. So I can go ahead and eliminate D. And again, even if I replace did with caused, it doesn't, in no other historical sighting did Halley's Comet cause such a worldwide sensation as its return of 1910 to 1911 caused. Okay, maybe sounds okay, but again, I have that word in, and that word in really trips up the comparison there when I'm being very literal about it. Same thing with E here. In no other historical sighting did Halley's Comet cause such a worldwide sensation as its return in 1910 to 1911. Now, if I was speaking colloquially on the street, yeah, I'd probably say it like E. But the comparison in other historical sightings versus in this historical sighting is simply much better. In C, the comparison in E is inferior, and so for that reason, I can eliminate it. This question is a great example, though, of the type of thing that you can see with challenging GMAT comparisons. essentially what happens is, number one, I've got to be very literal. And number two, I've got to keep in mind that I'm looking for the best answer choice. So in this instance, yeah, I would love to have in other historical sightings versus in this particular historical sighting. And fortunately, I have that for one of my answer choices. But always remember that I'm looking for the best answer choice. And really, when it comes to comparisons as a whole, hopefully this video has been helpful for you. But a couple key takeaways. Number one, as these comparisons get more challenging on the GMAT, you have to be more and more literal. And really, you have to be literal with the easy ones too, but it just becomes harder and harder to be more literal as the comparisons become more challenging. And then the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that sometimes these comparisons, the marker's not super obvious and it's not super actionable. So you really have to do, which goes back to the logical piece, you really have to do a lot of logical thought about what's being compared to what. I hope this video has been helpful to you, and I hope that you now have a better understanding of how to tackle GMAT comparisons. Make sure that you tune back in next week as we continue with our sentence correction series.